Howdy. Thanks for listening to Let the Movie Speak. Before we get started, we'd like to ask a favor of you.
It's a simple favor. If you could just rate and review our show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you listen, that might help other ears get into our ecosystem here and hear another episode. Anyway, enjoy the show.
This is the story you've heard about, talked about. The spine-tingling, blood-chilling story that stunned your emotions. Frankenstein.
Don't touch that!
In 1910, Thomas Edison's production company brings Mary Shelley's revered novel Frankenstein to life in a silent film. 10 years later, an Italian version is censored so heavily that its inevitable box office failure leads to the film eventually being lost. Another 10 years would pass before Universal Studios introduced American audiences to the now quintessential version of Frankenstein's monster.
Let the movie speak.
Welcome back, everybody, to Let the Movie Speak. My name is Travis.
And I'm Justin.
And we're super excited to be back with another episode looking at another film from our first series here from the 1930s. We already touched on a film from 1931, and then we're going back there for today's episode.
Circling the wagons.
Circling them up. And this is for one of the original Universal monster flicks, Frankenstein, and I think it's going to be a good conversation. What do you think, Justin?
Yeah, I'm excited. A little different, I think, than what you and I both expected going in. But I think we will have no shortage of things to talk about.
Yeah, agreed. Before we get into Frankenstein, as we are going to do every week, we want to just give you a little window into our watching tastes and some things we've been taking in, and that's in a section we call what did we watch this week? So, Justin, what did you watch this week?
Me and Mrs. Justin watched...
That's what I always call her.
Right, yeah. Most people do. It's on the certificate
Nice.
of life. And, we watched Jojo Rabbit,
Yes.
Taika Waititi's 2019, right? Not 18?
Yes,
I think?
that's correct.
Okay. 2019 film about a young boy in the Hitler Youth whose imaginary friend is Hitler, played by Taika,
Yes.
and him coming to terms with his mother hiding a Jewish girl in the attic.
Yeah.
And my goodness, I know that you had told me you had seen this movie and you recommended it to me, but and when you do, you don't recommend movies lightly usually. So. I knew that it was probably going to be good, but I was really surprised by how good it is. I mean, first of all, what a tough concept to try to sell.
Jeez. Yeah.
Hitler as funny, you know?
Yes.
And of course, it's not real Hitler. He's not Taika Waititi. I mean, I've heard that he has Russian Jewish ancestry, so it's not like he comes from this, insensitive, Eurocentric, whatever you want to call it, kind of worldview that could be disastrous,
right?
And very insensitive and just wrong. But he really is able to capture Hitler as if, it is the Hitler that lives in this little boy's brain,
Yeah.
who has been raised and brainwashed to believe, the Third Reich is the savior of the world. And I don't have really many bad things to say about it. And by not many, I mean none. It's a powerful story. It's very, while it is very comedic in a lot of its turns, it's comedic. I think it succeeds because so much of that comedy seems to stem from the child's perspective or the other kids in the film.
Yeah.
So it's not like there is some kind of goofy stuff that happens with other adults too, like when our friend Stephen Merchant comes in as the Gestapo.
Oh my gosh, he's so good.
I mean, so some of that stuff is just good writing and good comedy. But I feel like we especially get away with the Hitler thing because it really is genuinely, you believe that it is this kid's idealized version of Hitler. And I really loved, I don't know what kind of specifics you loved about this movie. I really appreciated how Hitler makes this progression throughout the movie where he starts off, and it's in his appearance, it's in the way he talks, it's in his dress, even his wardrobe. Yep. You know, it's the Hitler. You're watching Hitler evolve from like when the Nazi Party started until those final days in the bunker, and to watch Taika do this kind of, he's a very comedic guy, and I read that he didn't even want to do this movie. He wanted to tell a story like this, but he felt like he was not capable of presenting a straight drama, so he had to write a comedy. Mm-hmm. And I find that fascinating from a guy that's able to do campy, funny, silly Hitler. And then in like the third act, he gives that speech to the kid, which I'm pretty sure is just a translated version of a real Hitler speech. Mm-hmm. And he does it with the Hitler gestures. And I mean, it's incredible. It's really frightening to watch.
It's good. It's not just like, it's not just some caricature thing. He really does. He does hit like real Hitler at times, just enough to keep the whole thing at arm's length, right? Like,
yes,
he has so much fun, like playing in the playground of, okay, this is a 10-year-old's version of Hitler, and he's preposterous and silly, but the threat that is so real is always there, like as an anchor. And
right,
yeah, I saw that in theaters and didn't expect to like love it. Just thought like, oh, this is Taika Waititi. Generally like what he's done so far, and the concept is cool. But I just remember, it crushed me. Like, and I, having no expectations is sometimes the best way to go into a movie. We can talk about that in regards to Frankenstein, but the things that I liked the most about Jojo Rabbit, the kids are all great. It's hard to get kids that are that good. That's number one. But the supporting cast is epic. Like, Scarlett Johansson is incredible in this movie. And I've always been kind of on the fence about her. Like, is she even good, or is she just, a face that, gets thrown into, action movies or, the Marvel stuff because she brings money. But man, if there's any doubt about that in the past year, right? Like, watch Marriage Story and then watch this. Like, she's legit. She has chops. She can do a lot of different stuff. She's great. Sam Rockwell, Rebel Wilson, Stephen Murray, like the supporting cast of comedic characters is utilized so well. Like, Rebel Wilson's one of those supporting comedic actors who I find, 50% of the time hilarious and 50% of the time obnoxious, because it's always the same joke. But it's perfectly placed here. And the dramatic heft that is wielded alongside the screwball comedy like aesthetics is like, I don't know. I don't remember when the last time I've seen that is. It sort of feels like a Wes Anderson movie with more feeling, like with humanity, more emotional depth. Yeah.
Yeah, and to its credit, it ends well, not just in terms of a comedy. I mean, that ending is an ending for movies in general. With the two kids dancing at the end to David Bowie's Heroes.
Yeah, to a German version, right?
Yes, yeah, exactly.
So interesting,
I mean, that song is, I think maybe you and I have talked about, not on the podcast, but privately, about how overused that song has sadly become in cinema.
Yeah.
But I think Taika earns the right to put it in there, and it's very appropriate in keeping with the tone of the movie. But
it's the Flight of the Bumblebee of like, 80s stuff. Like, it's just, it's ubiquitous, and it loses meaning when you use it and use it and use it. And this is like, yep, that's exactly right. Yeah, really.
Yeah.
I would recommend everybody see Jojo Rabbit, because I don't know who wouldn't like it. I mean, like, it's funny. The story is really moving. Historically, like, I just don't see that kind of quirky and yet super thoughtful look at that period of history. Really, I don't know. Again, I don't know what else to say about it that's negative. I think I like it.
I think kind of fundamentally what I find so special about that movie is it works because the kid is a human and therefore relatable, and the other characters are human too. So yes, are there Nazis that are bad in this movie? Of course there are. Okay, we're talking about Nazis. But then there's the Sam Rockwell character. He is more concerned with being human through his course of the movie than with being a Nazi. And I think that is, we don't want to we don't want to excuse anything in history. We don't want to rewrite history. We don't want to do any of that. But I think if you're going to look at any era of history, of any tragedy, of any war, you're going to always find conflicted, complex, gray areas on both sides. So you're going to find conflicted characters like Sam Rockwell. And so I found it refreshing because it's it works, I think, ultimately, because it's more concerned with answering these kind of human questions.
Yeah.
How do we negotiate? How do we get along with each other? That's kind of the movie's big question to me.
Agreed. Strong recommend for Jojo Rabbit for sure.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, what'd you watch this week?
So I finished off the HBO series The Vow, which is a documentary series on the Nexium cult. And like with most series of that nature, it's incredibly bleak at times, but also I feel like really enlightening for folks who just with any ideology, right, like go into things blindly and without objectivity. And it you know what it answered for me, which is I think really important, is this idea of like people who get caught up in something that in the end is so insane. When we look back on it, we always assume like, okay, well, these are impressionable, weak people. That's not true. Like the programming and the essentially brainwashing that takes place with these people in power who have influence over other people. This can happen to your next door neighbor. This can happen to someone in your family, because we are, broken, all of us, right? Like we have a brokenness that needs fixing, and the places we look and the people who offer solutions are so, they have an opportunity to come in and offer solutions that, end up being sinister. So really compelling. And I feel like, on another note, subject matter that is really heavy, but handled with so much aplomb. Like you can watch this and think like, wow, that's a terrible thing that happened to that person, but you never feel like it's exploitative or, like overly like wallowing in the most graphic things, because it can to be shocking. It's really thoughtful and it has a good ending, which is nice. Some of these, like true crime or documentary series about, they just have like the ending is like, and the man got away and was never caught, and you don't have to deal with that at the end of this one. It's pretty satisfying. So I would recommend The Vow. It's on HBO Max. That's if you're into that sort of thing. That's pretty much it for me. Is that pretty much it for you?
It's pretty much it.
Okay. Well, I think it's time to meet the monster. What do you think?
I'm ready to open the door and let him in.
Let's do it. So 1931's Frankenstein. We have basically a blockbuster, big budget movie we're tackling, and directed by James Whale. Obviously, it was Mary Shelley's famous novel from 1818. It then became a play in 1927, which this script was adapted from. So that play script became the adaptation material for the movie script, and it stars, among others, Colin Clive as Victor Frankenstein, Boris Karloff as the monster. What would you say as far as just giving people an idea of what kind of movie this is? And also, what was your experience with it before this week?
So this is one of the first movies I remember watching as a kid. I think it was around Halloween time, and I was probably about 6 or something. And my folks rented a tape of this and put it on. And I remember a couple key scenes from this movie, really just from the end. And and I wept. I wept at the end, Travis, I have to confess.
That's really disappointing.
Injustice had been done to Mr. Frankenstein's monster.
Yes.
But until we watched it for this podcast again, I hadn't seen it. So it'd been quite a long time since I'd seen it. Have you ever seen this movie before?
So I feel like I have. Again, I feel like it's got to be like on AMC in October, like every year. So I used to. I think more so than you, a pretty big purveyor of the genre, of the horror genre.
Yes.
It's one of my favorites, if not my favorite. So I'm sure I have seen this movie, but not necessarily sat down with the intention to watch it, just sort of flicking through. This was the first time I watched it intentionally and at an age where I could, make sense of the whole story, not just sequences, which I think is going to be a common theme here. This movie is a movie that's remembered for sequences. I don't think that it's regarded as like, Citizen Kane or something like,
Hopefully not.
Yeah, I do. I also hope not. And I think that's a good hint at our feelings about the movie. I went into it this time with, I would say like, I knew what it was going to be, I knew that it wasn't, for instance, on a previous episode, we discussed Fritz Lang's M, which is very, ambitious and subversive and just really deep, for lack of a better term. This is not any of those things. And
Right.
It was even less so than I expected, because one thing that I kept noticing scene after scene is that this is a production value movie, right? Like all the money and the time and the effort is in the set building. It's in the costuming,
Yes.
the lighting, and all those things for a film of this era. It looks great, like for what it is. They achieved the look they were going for. I don't think there's any mistakes in that department. But as far as like taking a big bite of philosophical meaning or, whatever, you got to work at it a little,
Yeah, I agree. And this movie doesn't really, other than selling tickets, which is an important job that any movie has to do, especially from a big studio, I don't feel like it has a mission, and it doesn't really know what it's trying to accomplish. And you mentioned this was adapted from a play, and I feel like this movie comes off as half play, half movie, in some of the kind of bizarre staging choices and even some of the dialogue.
Yeah.
And things. Did you get that feeling at all watching this?
Yeah, I think to some degree, everything from the 30s, other than maybe something like, again, the aforementioned M, which is just like it floats above, the regular riffraff. This is like high budget riffraff, but it's a popcorn movie. It's if you were to equate it to something nowadays, I don't know, it's like a Transformers movie almost, like that level of, sure, there's some thought given to some character meaning and some depth, but a lot of it, I think, in the 30s is like what they knew was theater, and then silent films pretty briefly. Silent films,
Right.
20 years, 25 years, maybe 30 years for some folks, but mostly people went kind of from a familiarity with theater to this. So I think there's a sensibility, right, about acting and staging and blocking and a lot of that stuff where you can see the seams between theater and a film like this for sure. Yeah.
Well, and I found it really interesting. I assume this is on every version that we can now access when we rent or buy the movie. Before the title credits even roll, you have this guy come out on stage as if you are in a theater.
Yeah.
And give you.
And he comes from a curtain. He comes between the
right
a curtain.
And he essentially gives you 1931's version of clickbait.
Yes.
And so to liken that to Transformers, I think is very accurate. There's no trailer reveal, so he gives you this half-hearted like, this might be kind of scary. I don't know if you want to watch this, but yes, you do. And that's even in the credits. I don't know if you noticed in the title credits, the monster is played by a question mark, as if that's going to be the bit who plays him.
Right.
And thankfully they answer that question at the end, because I was biting my nails wondering the
Oh
whole
my
time.
gosh, who the heck was it?
Yeah, I'm still not sure.
Yeah.
I'm learning to read.
There's still
but,
debate. There is an interesting point about casting that maybe goes in this little intro section where in the same year, Dracula, starring Bela Lugosi, which if you're not familiar with the history of the horror genre, the universal monsters from this era are what started to build, like, what does horror look like from American cinema. So you have, you Dracula, you have the Wolfman, you have Frankenstein, the Invisible Man. All of these universal monster characters became tentpole, big budget, and profitable movies. Bela Lugosi starred in Dracula in the same year. They released both these movies in 1931. It made tons of money for the time and place, and therefore Frankenstein kind of got fast-tracked. Bela Lugosi was supposed to star as Frankenstein's monster, but after some makeup tests and some very upset sentiments from Mr. Lugosi, who I think I read a quote somewhere where he said, like, I am an esteemed actor and I don't want to be playing, what is essentially a mindless zombie. Mr. Boris Karloff was found and selected, but yeah, I think that really sets the stage for what we should expect when we watch a movie like this. I think what I'm going to keep coming back to, and I think you'll agree with this, Justin, is this is a more important movie to cinema than it is a good movie to watch.
Agreed.
Yeah. So, let's see. I don't think I'm missing anything for intro. I think that's pretty much it. We were both about the same amount of familiar with it, and then we saw what we saw, and I think it's probably about time to get into what we saw. What do you think?
I'm ready.
Let's do it. So what's it saying? This is, we're talking about some plot stuff, the overall feel of it, acting, story. And I mean, in general, I think we've already sort of revealed our hand here. Nothing here blew me away. There's a few, I think, things to highlight, but we have a story that centers around a pretty small cast. And I think this movie is designed to be spectacle and not much else. I didn't expect to come in comparing it to Transformers, but I don't think that was a bad reference, actually, now that I keep thinking about it. Early on, I noted that the production value is really obvious, right? Like for a movie from this era, just the map paintings and set design and the grandness of all of it is pretty obvious. Nothing has ever looked more like a soundstage than the graveyard scene.
Oh my goodness!
But I
enjoy when one of the actors, he so obviously is being directed like, okay, now you're gonna walk over the last mound, and then you can't keep walking straight because you'll walk into the painting.
Yes.
So you have to make a hard left.
Hard left.
And so you see everyone make that hard left like inches from the painting.
Yes. Yeah.
It's a little humorous.
So that's like absolutely you can see that in some of those blocking choices and whatever. But I do think that the prop and set designers and builders, like I wrote down theater-like, just like you said, it feels like theater. They deserve a lot of the credit for why this movie stands the test of time as far as imagery and sequences, because
sure,
the look of it is certainly iconic and would go on to be replicated many, many times.
The look is iconic and I think speaks volumes to the talent involved, like we talked about with the set design. I did find it interesting in the same way the theater kind of dialogue that's in there has not stood the test of time.
Right.
Such as in aforementioned graveyard scene when Frankenstein finds I'm sorry, it's not the graveyard scene, but it's very close to that, where they find the guy on the gallows that's been hung, and Frankenstein pulls out a knife and hands it to his henchman, Fritz, and that's not good enough. He says, "Here's a knife." Like, yes, we know, we can see it, thank you. And then it doesn't stop there. Fritz goes and cuts the guy down, and then Fritz says, "Here's the knife." And then you hear something go clunk. And then he says, "Here I come."
Yes.
And he's coming down. Like, it's just, it's something that would make a lot more sense to me if you were sitting 200 feet away in a theater.
Yeah.
But it's so inessential
like
to the
it
story.
belongs on a title card in a silent movie, because it's just like exposition being fed to you that isn't really that important anyway. But I think what we're trying to do is catch stuff beyond just the aesthetics. Certainly the aesthetics are worth mentioning, but early on, the fact that they make a distinction between normal brain and abnormal brain, and then there's this really ham-fisted line, right? Like, this is the brain of a criminal, and drawing
right.
So obviously they're trying to make a big point to say, like, the reason Frankenstein's monster is going to be screwed up in some way is because his brain came from a criminal.
Criminal brain.
We don't even know what that criminal did. He could have stolen some potatoes or something. Like, it doesn't say he was a murderer.
Yeah.
So I mean, what do you find in the in the early kind of sequences or sections, what do you see as them trying maybe desperately to lay some meaningful groundwork?
Yeah, it's confusing because in one sense this is, Optimus Prime in 1930, but it is there's also these weird attempts at like philosophy and theology even. The guy in the curtain, he comes out and he says, I'm sorry, he's not in a curtain. Okay, he comes from behind a curtain. Anyway,
And that's Edward Van Sloan, who plays Dr. Waldman. I didn't realize that till the end.
Okay. And so he says something like he tries to make a man in his own image, which is it sounds very biblical, and but then he says, something about, but he does it without God.
Right.
So you get this, I mean, that's a pretty, you think you're going to have a movie that maybe has something kind of serious to say. And to this movie's credit, it's not all just like, oh, here comes a monster, let's hide.
It tries from time to time, yeah.
Right, but it's also he's got that line in that intro, but then like I mentioned, it's kind of also like an antique circus, behold the Elephant Man, if you dare, kind of a thing. And so the brain is another example, I think, where the conversely, the brain that the inept help drops when he's trying to steal it for Dr. Frankenstein is supposed to be this specimen, the finest brain we've ever seen, for also undisclosed reasons. And the criminal brain is definitely inferior. So it's not, I don't feel like that really has anything to do with the kind of really watered down lukewarm theology or whatever that was kind of introduced in the beginning. But it does seem to indicate that people have value based on what they do.
Yeah.
And if you are a criminal, then you are a drain on society, and you are apparently worthy for having medical experiments done on you. And so what's interesting is that all of Frankenstein's, the parts of the people or whatever that he's getting, we don't know the circumstances for the first grave that he robs, why that person died and were they a common criminal or a fine specimen. But we also see him, again, cutting down people from the gallows. So Frankenstein, if there's any hope that Frankenstein is going to turn out well, it's kind of, the movie is indicating that Frankenstein is kind of sabotaging himself, almost purposefully, which I found really bizarre. And I also found it kind of funny that they're also talking about the, we still hear things about this today, especially as it relates to like, should children, of a certain age or teenagers, do they have the mental capacity to commit crimes or things? And what a lot of that kind of scientific discussion that I've read or heard about has to do with the frontal lobe.
Right.
And is that developed? And that's exactly what Dr. What's his name, Waldman says to Dr. Frankenstein.
Yeah.
He talks about the scarcity of convolutions on the frontal lobe. Like, well, yeah, obviously, it must be a real idiot then,
right.
And so I don't know. It's just it's kind of frustrating to me, to be frank with you, because it doesn't really land anywhere solid.
Yeah.
It doesn't. It goes to the trouble to kind of set these things up, but they're really just set up as like, we got to have them talk about something else for a couple more lines,
right.
is what it feels like, and it never comes back.
Yeah, I think it comes from this sort of stuck place, which is, the novel, but by extension the film. This story is considered one of the first true science fiction films. Certainly there were stories around the same time as Frankenstein, but some people argue this is the earliest science fiction novel because what is the setup, right? Most of the time, what we're used to in Greek mythology or fables or any story like that, there's something fantastical or spiritual going on, right? If there's a monster, it's a spirit or it's possessed, or there's a spiritual grounding there. And this story originally, and it comes through in that science speak, there's nothing like that here. This is a man who is, he's in the science world. He believes he's a scientific solution to bringing about life. That spirituality, that that we find in the dialogue and whatever, it just lands like a wet towel because the two things don't really mix, like, or they don't mix well enough to work,
Yeah.
So there are moments that this is, I think, my main contention that I'll get to by the end. There are moments that, like, if that was the whole movie, or if the movie centered around those ideas, it would be a lot more compelling. And I don't think because, like, I'm not opposed to science fiction or a science-based story kind of being the motor that drives the thing, but because it's trying to do both things at the same time, it doesn't really do either of them that well. The earliest example of censorship, which is something that we'll come back to time and time again with this movie, because it's not like they cut out 40 minutes of it or anything crazy like that,
right,
like that Italian version. But it has some key moments that censorship played a role in that I think inform character, which is really interesting. The first thing that you'll notice if you do any research on the censorship of this film was that after its initial release, I think before its distribution in some states, because this is pre-MPAA, this is pre-code, the Hays Code, which basically was like the MPAA, but a little bit more Wild Wild West, where they had even more control, and it was a little bit state by state based on those kinds of rules and regulations. But is the sequence when he brings the creature to life, he gets the gurney down from the ceiling, and the hand moves, and he says, it's alive, which everybody's super familiar with. The next line is he says, in the name of God, now I know what it feels like to be God. That entire line of dialogue is cut in 1931 because people were like,
blasphemy.
That's right, too blasphemous. But I look at that and I'm like, well, one of the most interesting things about this is the fact that he's struggling with wanting to play God and seeing how that turns out, so that changes the complexion of that character a little bit. I do think it's worth noting that I think Colin Clive is very good in this, especially compared to some of his counterparts. He's got a theatrical presence, but he has really good, like strong, scary when he needs to be a little scary, but just really committed to all of this. Like, he sells it. He sells the melodrama of it and the kind of closer moments, I think, as well as somebody really can. He's got good like pauses in his delivery. He makes proximity a thing where he like gets really close to people when he's trying to be compelling. So that feels like, I'm sure, I didn't look this up, but he has to have been a stage actor. You can almost feel it coming right through the screen.
Yeah, I feel like everyone, but I don't have nearly as many issues with his acting as the vast majority of the rest of the cast. But to me, it felt like everyone except for Boris Karloff and the guy that plays Daddy Frankenstein, or Baron Frankenstein, everyone else feels like they're acting. And they're acting very hard. And so there's no sense of maybe it's part of the, I don't know how many of those people maybe came from the stage too, or from obviously
films,
a different era of filmmaking. But it is really, it's possibly a directorial problem too. I'm sure the problem is kind of multifaceted, but it was kind of shocking to me how by today's standards, at least, how bad some of the acting is, how wooden, or just how, what's the do you know the actress that plays Elizabeth?
I don't have her name in front of me. I'll find it.
Okay. And in the amount of expression that her eyebrows do more work than she does, I think, to try to deliver dialogue. And so it comes across, everything that most characters say is just very perfunctory. It's very much, here's a knife. So
that's the theme of the movie. Here's a knife.
Here's a knife. Yeah, that was the subtitle.
Yes.
And so it just feels, it gives it a very tepid aftertaste, really.
Sure.
Because again, like, I think you and I both found a couple different, not even scenes, but more like sequences or short clips kind of interesting or moving, or like Frankenstein's line about being God. Okay, that's interesting. Where can we go with that? And the answer to those questions is generally nowhere.
Nowhere fast.
Which is bizarre to me.
Mae Clark as as Elizabeth Lavenza. That's the eyebrow lady.
That's the eyebrow lady.
Yeah.
And she puts those eyebrows to work, and her eyes are always gazing heavenward, looking for the answers. I'm looking up right now, but this is a podcast, so you can't see that.
She's wistful, and that's it. I think we mentioned this before that started, but like she plays one emotion, and that is wistful, and it's pretty much one note the whole time. So lest anyone think all we're going to do is rag on this movie, I want to highlight some things that I thought were well done, good.
Please do.
Within the bulk of the thing. I really like a few of the cinematography choices throughout. Most of it is a little on the perfunctory side. I think, again, the goal here was to capture the scale and the scope and really the surroundings. It's not really, let's put this fascinating character in an interesting place in the frame. But one example of that, a nice artistic flourish, is there's a really good shot where Waldman and Dr. Frankenstein are trying to find Fritz, because he's made a horrible noise, and they run and they open a door, and it's a long shot where they walk in and you just see Fritz hanging there on the side, and they just sort of walk in and look at him. It's a really good way of establishing some kind of foreboding. What is this creature capable of? That's a pretty looking shot. I remember that. I do think there's a couple points where they try to bring class right into the conversation. The dad, okay, before we go on to more characters, is this one of the earliest examples of an unfortunate trend in American cinema where they are fully German in Germany? This is a German story and film, you know?
Yes.
Everybody just sounds bizarrely accented. Like most of them are doing like a pseudo-British affectation, sort of like a...
Transatlantic thing.
Yeah, like we did Shakespearean theater, so this is how you bring seriousness. But then, like Dr. Waldman has a fully German accent, but he's speaking English. The dad is like, he's like way British, you know. He's like, well, I'm not sure what we're going to do about that, but you know, it's like it's very confused, and every once in a while it really sticks out. It's like, I am Baron von Frankenstein, and it's like, you can't say Baron von Frankenstein.
Listen here.
Yeah.
No, I'm Baron von Frankenstein.
Yeah. And it's very weird.
And I think this movie maybe was, I don't think it was made for this reason, right? But it kind of serves as a test, like, okay, how much do Americans care about this?
Right.
You know? And so I don't know, because I don't speak all the languages of the world, how America, you know, if a story is set in America, how that's portrayed in that nation's cinema. But it is a problem that still exists today.
Oh my gosh.
Even though, you know, we are so much more able to accomplish kind of amazing feats in movies. Like, think about Mel Gibson's The Passion of the Christ, filmed all in Aramaic.
A dead language.
Right, and I mean, it's incredible, and to me that especially sets the bar for the era we live in.
Sure.
As far as what's capable of being accomplished and how beautiful that can be, and how much more meaningful and serious and involved it can be. But yet, then we have, you know, a couple years later, you get Tom Cruise and Valkyrie.
That's what I was going to bring up.
Playing, you know, oh yeah, we're gonna kill Hitler. Like, it's not a Mission Impossible movie, Tom. I don't buy it.
And I remember specifically when that movie came out, they were doing press junkets and interviews, and it was the laziest answer I've ever heard for a question like this. It was like, so it's interesting that you all chose to just, you know, retain your natural accents. Nobody's doing a German accent. And literally, like, the director, the actors, their answer was like, yeah, we felt like instead of everybody trying to do a German accent and being bad at it, essentially, we just thought we would do our own accents and people would get used to it. It's like, what the heck is, like, that's the we were artistically lazy, essentially.
Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, imagine if they said the same thing about costumes. Hey, we see you guys doing this World War II period piece,
right,
but you're all in jeans and in Tommy Hilfiger shirts. What's that all about? Well, we just thought people would get used to it.
Yeah.
You know, like, no, we can't. You can't get used to it, and I think that's to those, including this movie. It's to the because honestly, Travis, watching this movie, I couldn't I wasn't sure until we got to a certain place, and I think it was seriously when I saw the men dancing in lederhosen at the wedding,
Yeah.
where I was like, "What? Where is this happening?"
Yeah.
I couldn't figure out based on the I didn't know what year it was.
Yeah.
I didn't know what country it was. I didn't know what time it was. I didn't know where I was. And so some of those issues have to do with my mental sanity,
Yes.
and they're not all related to the movie. But yeah, it was not. I don't think it was explicitly obvious where this movie was until the Germans were dancing.
Yeah, I mean,
and somebody was called the Burgermeister.
There we
that
go.
That was a giveaway.
I looked at thanks to this movie, I know what a Burgermeister is, and that's one of the most important things.
Can you please tell us what a Burgermeister is?
It's the mayor of a Dutch, Flemish, German, Austrian, or Swiss town. So there you go.
Yeah, that's very good. Thank you.
Danke. Thank you. And
Okay.
so anyway, this all started because I couldn't let that point just sit there. But they do try to bring class into it occasionally. The dad
Right.
is certainly portrayed and pictured as a aristocratic, wealthy, literally monocle wearing, stuffy kind of
Right.
drinking
Right.
guy. But he has this line where at one point he says, "Give the servants some champagne. This stuff would be wasted on them."
I wrote the same thing down.
Yeah.
So there's this weird. And I'm sorry if I interrupted you. I'm just so excited that we wrote down the same line.
It's really exciting.
It's like, okay, so this movie acknowledges there's some kind of class problems, because it doesn't say that in a way to glorify that or be like, haha, get those stupid servants, It's in a way where like the help is right there,
Right.
And they get their champagne and they're not afforded grandma's nice wine or great grandma's wine or whatever. But
Which is, why do they keep bringing that? That is a point that, like, the dad brings that up like 4 times. It's like,
yeah,
this
it's the last shot in the movie
Yeah,
is him drinking the wine.
oh my gosh, we'll talk about that at the end. That's
Okay.
ridiculous. Yeah.
All right, but I just wanted to kind of echo your. Well, I'm not echoing, am I? Because I interrupted your sentiments.
No, you're good.
But so again, the movie, kind of like with the God line, I know what it's like to be God. Now it's like, okay, there's some potentially interesting issues to talk about class and sensitivity or insensitivity to those issues, and nope, we're just gonna throw a line out there and all right, time to move on now. Where's
Yeah.
Frankenstein's monster?
It pays some lip service to seriousness, and it really just whiffs it, and just kind of in the name of, I think, mass appeal, right? It moves
Yes.
on from those things very quickly, and therefore you're left with, like, if you're not just trying to watch it for spectacle, you're left empty-handed in a lot of ways.
Right. Right.
But let's talk about a couple moments where there is some substance to be found, and they're a little few and far between, but they're there if you look for them with your microscope. I do think the character with your monocle, exactly. The character of Fritz, it has more to say substantively with the way that they use him than I think Frankenstein or Dr. Waldman, or in some ways the creature, the monster. He has a patheticness and a cruelty about him that is interesting, and another point of censorship, which is in that sequence where he's whipping the monster essentially just to torture him because he's chained up. I guess they're trying to quiet him down, but he's whipping him. Dr. Frankenstein comes in and he says, "Stop! You're going to have the whole village will be after us," or whatever. And then he leaves, and then he takes the torch and he tortures him some more. There's a close up there of the monster's face and his fear of the fire, and it just drives home the point that, like, Fritz is not just trying to do his job; he's being wicked, in this moment. And then that's going to be contrasted later with the monster's interaction with the girl by the water. So I really think between those two scenes, those are the ones that I walk away with like, there might be something there to mull, but they don't do a lot with it. That next scene, I think we'll probably talk about more than anything because it's the most interesting thing in the film in a lot of ways.
And right before we get there, just to kind of in that same time frame of Fritz, when I was watching, I was kind of wondering out loud sometimes, why does this brilliant scientist, albeit an unethical one, have such a bumbling henchman?
Yeah.
But I get that his this is not a movie made with necessarily any kind of realism in mind, and so I get that his role is more figurative or metaphorical,
Right.
And as Mrs. Justin, again, there she is, sagely pointed out, I think that, and what I agree with her in, is that he is an outcast. He's a reject from society. He is at the bottom of the barrel, and he's finally found something he thinks he can have power over.
Yes.
Something that is less than him. And so, unfortunately, I think that's really true, and that's very human. But as soon as we start to examine that, Fritz is dead.
Yeah.
And so we have to move on. But in that same kind of setting, one thing that I found really interesting is when Dr. Frankenstein, does something to the windmill, opens a window or something, or like a skylight, kind of, a windmill's version of a skylight.
Yes.
And Frankenstein's monster reaches up with outstretched hands to the light.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, oh my gosh. And then he's like, well, close it up, right? And then the monster's just left like back in the darkness. And I thought, wow, this is really on the nose. Here we are. You have someone reaching for the light, but shut out and told to sit in darkness. I mean, he literally tells him to sit down.
Yeah.
And I thought, oh my goodness, this is going to be a little too on the nose, but it's not, because we never come back to that.
Right.
But I think that is really, it's a really interesting point to try to make about how doing such things to people, showing them light, giving them, just the knowledge of opportunity to whatever you want to call it, live successfully or be free or do something or just experience the world in a positive way.
Yeah.
And instead being told or forced to live, so to speak, on the other side of the tracks, or in Frankenstein's case, in the dungeon of a windmill.
Mm-hmm.
Well, of course that's going to breed evil. That's going to breed hate, that's going to not lead to anything good.
Yeah.
But again, I don't know that the audience is really given... I mean, it's like, what is that scene? Like 10 seconds?
Yeah.
So you really have to, like you said, you really got to get your monocle out and work for this stuff.
2 monocles stacked on top of each other, and
it's always more effective.
That's how you see the small things. Yeah, I agree. Everything that feels like it's on the verge of really saying something is sort of just gone in the blink of an eye. And that draws a pretty straight line for us to the sequence at the edge of the water. The creature escapes, and his interaction with the girl at the edge of the water is the most interesting thing in the movie for me.
Yes, me too.
Boris Karloff turns in a very good, nonverbal, essentially, performance. That's a super challenging thing to do. Especially in the context of, ridiculous costume and big spectacle sets and all that. Like especially in that scene with the little girl, just you see her, trying to do her best to not judge this person she doesn't know, and showing him kindness and including him in her life. And then and he tries to do what he thinks is logical, and it ends up being a tragic thing. This is the most like classic example of censorship from this movie, because of the way that scene ends, it was completely cut down. And this is weird because the way it was cut down, I think, makes it more sinister than it turns out in the versions we can now see, which is the full scene. The cut version stops that sequence at the moment that he reaches his arms out to the little girl. He sees the flower, he throws it, he sees that it floats on top of the water, and then he starts to reach out to her, and not in an evil way, but like okay, so the next thing we should do is this, right? And they cut right there, and they go to the next sequence. So you see him reaching for this girl, and then they cut away. You don't know what happens, except for that they say later that she drowned. So to me, not seeing him be shocked and surprised by the fact that she didn't float, and then running into the weeds and dealing with that, like, very like, basic guilt that he's dealing with, like that's what sympathizes him and makes him have some nuance. So thank goodness we have the restored version now, but that interaction with the little girl, I mean, is actually affecting. And as a sequence, that's one of the things I would pull and put on my shelf to remember this movie by. What do you have to say about that sequence?
Yeah, no, that is frankly one of the two things that stuck with me since I first saw it when I was 6. Was that whole sequence was kind of preserved in memory of the picking the flowers, and I guess I was fortunate enough in whatever decade that was with fun VHS to have an uncensored version.
Right. 1987 is when that scene was restored. So like the tape versions. Which is crazy to think about. For 50 years, if you watch this movie, which, to be frank, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, nobody was watching this unless it was some re-release in theaters because people didn't own movies. But when the VHS revolution happened, it was like right in 87, that version of it, which could be the version you watched if you watched it when you were, a youngin' and it was a few years old VHS tape. That's when it was restored.
Right. Yeah, and so it's a powerful scene. It works too, and you get, as deep as that movie is going to go is in that scene. I think, I couldn't. I don't want to just reiterate because that would be boring. But yeah, I am very impressed by Mr. Boris Karloff's turn as an actor in that scene, and even going back to what you said about him. In the censorship in the scene with Fritz torturing him, he really delivers a lot of emotional resonance by doing very. I think maybe it's partly because he's not given a lot to do, even though he's the monster. He's just not asked to. It's like, okay, just move around a little funny here.
He doesn't have a lot of agency. He's being acted upon, and he's reacting a lot. Yeah,
right. But the way that he is able to react as an actor, Man, just him kind of opening his mouth and giving those very sad moans or cries or whatever, it's very troubling, I think, because you relate to him, I think, more as a child or like, just kind of an innocent, like the bull in the china shop. Like he doesn't get it.
Yeah. You know what it reminded me of, Justin, was when we went and saw Jordan Peele's Us. We were sitting in a very rowdy audience for that movie. We liked it quite a bit, actually. But there were some audience reactions that were annoying. Like you get a crowd every once in a while in a theater. Remember those things called theaters where you could go and watch a movie?
Sounds familiar.
Yeah. They did not take to the like caveman kind of like the creatures in that movie. They have a verbal way of speaking, but it's very like prehistoric. It's weird. And we were watching it, and my skin was crawling because I feel like it was done in a way that like it's supposed to unsettle you. It's not supposed to be like, whoa, they're making funny noises. And I immediately thought of that when I was watching this because I see a little bit of that lifted in not a bad way. Like, it's almost like you said, you remember how, Boris Karloff verbalized his and gave that sort of direction. But I agree. I think that works really well too. I think coming off of that scene, maybe the best imagery and emotional sequence is the father walking through, the kind of town square where the party for the wedding is going on, and he has his dead daughter in his arms, and there's this just dancing and music and drinking beer, and he's walking through the crowds, and as soon as he passes by people, you see them stop and look and stop, and it's sort of this slow motion domino effect, and that was masterfully done. I mean, he's really good, the dad, as the actor, but the way it's shot is just a slow tracking shot following him. Another moment where I was like, okay, this is a sequence that needs to go in the archives. This is the reason, right? As we're getting to the end of our What's It Saying section, this is the stuff that the movie deserves to be remembered for. The spectacle, the scope, the fact that it is a literary adaptation, albeit a clunky one in many ways. But that's a sequence that I'll remember,
Absolutely. And I will also remember how disappointed I was with what they did with the sequence, which I think in a different director's hands, the crowd would not be so boisterous, or at least not as one man would they all be shouting and screaming as they go to the Burgermeister.
Yes.
But that's the choice that's made, and so you have this. I agree with you. It's the most moving image in the movie, I think, unless we want to talk about the kind of the climax of the movie.
Sure, let's get there.
But just real quick, just to wrap that up, when he delivers, so to speak, his daughter to the Burgermeister, the instead of there being kind of any reflection or like what do we do as a community about this. It just immediately moves on to like, okay, we got to wrap this movie up, let's get to the next thing. What happened? She drowned, she was murdered, let's go find the monster.
Right.
And it's like, well, how are you even gonna do it? Doesn't make sense. There's not a lot of investigation, so to speak, or questioning that happens. It just seems as a given, like the audience knows that they need to go find the monster.
Right.
So we're not going to make it hard for these people to figure out. They're just going to go find the monster.
Yeah. If we have to go back to M here, we have to, because dead kid, right? A child
Yes.
murder, a community reacting. This movie does what M did in about like 10 minutes, right? And with
Right.
like 4% of the thought put into it. You know what I'm saying? Like M
Yes.
asks that question from the beginning to the end. What do we do with this problem? It's
Right.
not exactly the same kind of a perpetrator, but as a community reacting to a tragedy that is, unthinkable in a lot of ways. This is so like, this is the meat-headed, just really dumbed down version of it. It's like, get the guy.
And I feel like that's a result of an overarching problem, which seems like the audience has to realize what's happening before the characters in the movie do.
Yeah.
So therefore, here's the knife kind of dialogue, or when any character makes some kind of blood-curdling scream, instead of, because you and I are already processing, okay, that's they're in the windmill, the doctors are together, only Fritz and the monster are there. That sounds like Fritz screaming. No, they don't just go like, oh crap, Fritz is in trouble. There's this, what's that? Do you hear that? Do you hear something in the background? Ah, my gosh, he's murdering me.
Yeah.
What could that be? Doctor, it's Fritz. And then they mobilize, and it's an odd use of screen time.
It's the
that
same
is
thing with
not
Dr.
very
Frankenstein
effective.
later, right? Like he's caught up with the monster and he's help me, and everyone's like, it's Dr. Frankenstein. Like we know. Everybody
Right.
we get it. Yeah.
Yeah,
agreed.
yeah.
It treats the audience as far less intelligent than something other
Yes.
than, like a movie like M that's impossible not to refer back to because of some overlap here. I think that I think, unless you want to pick anything else out, that covers what this movie feels like and looks like and says. I would say, just as one final note in this section, it's kind of boring. Like the middle third of this movie, it just kind of meanders. They don't do a lot in regards to pacing, and we can talk about that when it comes to the ending as well. Let's wrap it up, man. Let's get to our summative thoughts. What do you say?
Let's start hiking up Everest.
Let's do it. Okay, so final thoughts here. Neither of us were blown away by this. I think it delivers sort of what it intends to at times, but it doesn't intend on delivering much more than being a popcorn flick. Before we give our final thoughts, each of us, I do think it's worth touching on just a couple things that the novel does that the movie doesn't. Because,
Okay.
we spoke, this is an adaptation of an adaptation, essentially. This play script became a film script. The play script was based off the novel. But let me give you a couple things, because neither of us have read Mary Shelley's Frankenstein at any point recently or are super familiar with it. So I did some Spark Notes-esque research to see what are the main differences. And this is what I came up with. First of all, Mary Shelley wrote this, started writing this at 18, which is really impressive. It was published in 1818, argued as the first true science fiction story. But in the novel, some plot point differences. Okay, the creature is articulate. He learns to speak and read. He terrifies a family that he kind of is attempting to befriend. And because they react that way, even though he has good intentions, that's when he vows to have revenge on his creator. Because it's like he sees his reflection. He sees, I am hideous. How could anybody take me as anything but a monster? And that's what causes his character turn to say, I need to, destroy Dr. Frankenstein. First of all, that is a million times more interesting than what we see. But it goes on to the story then goes on. The creature requests a mate and vows, he wants a partner. So he says, you need to make me a wife, essentially. And he vows, if you do this for me, I'll leave you alone. And then the ending, all of that stuff is a lot more interesting and humanizing and nuanced than what we get in the movie. But the ending is what really, like, I wish I could see this. And you know what? There's like a billion film versions of this. Somebody somewhere might do this. I know there's a Kenneth Branagh adaptation of this with Robert De Niro as the Frankenstein monster, which sounds wild. But the ending: Victor's ship, Dr. Frankenstein's ship, is caught in pack ice. The creature is supposedly missing at this point. Victor dies, and he is adamant to his death that the creature must be destroyed. The creature is found on the ship as like a stowaway almost, and the captain, who's like the last one left, he assumes the creature must be at peace now because Dr. Frankenstein's dead, but the creature isn't. He is torn apart by the fact that his creator is killed, and he vows that he must be destroyed himself, and he drifts away on an ice raft, never to be seen again. And so I don't know. I think the thing we talked about earlier is like, the novel obviously gives the character of the creature far more agency, and I think that is what's missing here in large part. My summative review of this is it's a popcorn movie from 1931, and for it being that, it is visually impressive. You can see the money on screen. There are a couple good performances to be had here, I think, between the fellow who plays Dr. Frankenstein, Colin Clive, and Boris Karloff himself. Other than that, we always try to get to rewatchability. Like, how often would I rewatch this? Honestly, I would not watch the rest of this. I don't think I'll ever watch this again in its totality, because I think the only thing you need to see are the sequences that you can pull up on YouTube or wherever else and say like, oh, wow, that flower sequence is really interesting, or the windmill sequence is really interesting. Except we forgot to mention, holy cow, that is the worst dummy. It is. I was laughing literally out loud when he throws the dummy off the top of the windmill, and it like hits the blade, and then it lands on the ground. It's the worst looking dummy. I'm sorry, even for 1931, I was like, what? How did that make it? Right, and that is, I think that is sort of emblematic, right? In the peak moment of this movie, the thing that should be the most substantive and moving is it's just gutted because it's spectacle, and it does feel a little staged. And watch the good sequences. I don't really think you need to spend time on your master's thesis for 1931's Frankenstein. How about you?
Yeah, probably agree with you there. And to follow up on that dummy, it really shocking to me because I didn't remember every point of this movie that 170-pound man could be thrown from a height of 70 feet or so, land on the blade of a windmill so that his spine is in line with it and his legs overlap each side of the blade.
He crumples like a pretzel around that thing. It's ridiculous.
And then as the blade moves downward, it drops him even further to the ground. He falls on his back, and I thought that he's just dead, obviously. But no, he's recovering fine by the end of the movie. And frankly, I feel like that was the one time, because you buy into a monster movie like this, there's going to be some kind of sci-fi or fantasy elements. This guy's creating a monster from body parts, right?
Right.
So you have to suspend your disbelief in that way. But to watch Dr. Frankenstein be thrown from such a height and brutalized by inanimate objects and then recover by the end of the movie, I found that a lot more offensive to my sense of rationality than most of the rest of the movie. To me, the only other scene that I could remember from being a little Justin was Frankenstein burning in the windmill. And again, Boris Karloff, I mean, he's not, not trying to say this is some kind of A-list performance or something, but it's still very sad, because here's this monster who, yes, accidentally kills this little girl, and certainly something needs to be done, but the villagers, they just act like a mob, you know, and there's no... What does the Burgermeister say? Like, bring him alive if you can, but get him!
Yeah.
It's just this very, like, this is just how we do it out here in Germany. I don't know why they use that accent in that part of Germany.
It is like the film speaking to us directly. It's like, bring us some substance, but if you can't do that, just bring us something.
Yeah, no, I think that's fair. And so, walking away this time, I am I have a couple more things to hang on to, some of the points we talked about, which I'm not going to reiterate, but there are parts of this movie that are worthwhile. This is not a waste of time, and yeah, like you said, if you're a student of film or cinema, or you just want to appreciate, maybe you've heard people talk about how this is a classic or whatever, it can be kind of a fun endeavor, I think, to evaluate these things that are supposedly classic or amazing, even like books that are supposedly, part of high literature. Evaluating them for yourself, sometimes you're going to come away with a much different opinion. And so I would agree with you that this is informative and noteworthy for some of the things that it does, mostly related to scale and scope. But as it actually comes to telling a story and acting as a movie, it doesn't really know what it wants to be, and so it fails to be anything ultimately that has great meaning or importance. Mm-hmm. And that is kind of indicated in the very last scene, where father of young Dr. Frankenstein is talking about the wine again.
Oh my gosh!
And what's so freaking weird is the help brings him the wine.
Right.
The help that has no capacity that it would be wasted on them brings him the wine. So again, it's like, well, this is really interesting. What is this movie trying to say? And then he takes a swig of it, and the movie's over.
That's it.
And so my answer to that question is, I don't know. I really, truly don't know what this movie is trying to say. It offers some interesting theology. It would be like if you took a book by Freud or Nietzsche or someone that's a philosopher and not German, and just tore out a couple sentences from just one of their books. Just you took a page, you don't even tear out the page, you just tear out a couple sentences, and then have somebody read that, and then immediately start talking about something else. That's what this movie feels like to me. It's just, it's so disjointed, and so, in terms of, the ultimate question, what is it saying? Yes, it tells a kind of coherent plot, but as far as a message or, an overarching theme, it's really not there for me. Mm-hmm. The theme overarching is like, do you want a refill on your popcorn? Mm-hmm. And do you want to buy a ticket for the next matinee?
That's it. Yeah. And there would be a lot more matinees, because this, no shortage of sequels, remakes. This is a franchise building movie. This became a reoccurring thing. There were Boris Karloff sequels. There were, crossovers with Abbott and Costello, Frankenstein meets the Wolfman. This went, man, like people ate it up. And I think that just says something about, what audiences maybe want. But I don't think anybody's going to walk away from this with anything other than, well, the story is trying to say something really amazing. Well, really, the novel is. The movie isn't really. So how often would you rewatch this?
Oh, yes, that question. Like you, I probably wouldn't. If one of my kids or somebody was really, really keen on watching it for some reason and had never experienced it, I would gladly sit down and watch it again. But like you, I'm probably going to laugh when the Dr. Frankenstein gets thrown on the windmill.
Yeah,
and not be overly sympathetic to the movie as a whole. It is interesting, and so like you, I don't want listeners to think that, boy, this is just a pile of garbage. Don't waste your time. Mm-hmm. It doesn't reach for the same things as M, like I think we made pretty clear. But yeah, it does have historical significance, and I think more as something kind of culturally significant, or as kind of the genesis of, what started kind of this monster madness, or what was at the beginning.
Everyone should watch it once. That's my feelings on it.
And that's probably all you'll need.
All right, Justin, I think that's enough of the creature for today. I enjoyed talking about Frankenstein. How about you?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm looking forward to next week. I think we're talking about It Happened One Night. Is that right?
That's right. It's an early Frank Capra film. It stars Clark Gable, Claudette Colbert. Made a bunch of money and spawned another genre, the romantic comedy genre. So I'm excited about that. We hope you will join us again, and we will see you next week. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Let the movie speak.
Hey, since you're still here and still listening, thank you, by the way, we'd like to ask an additional favor of you.
We have social media. It's a thing on the internet, and all you need to do is find us on Instagram or Twitter or Facebook and like and subscribe. I know this is annoying, but we have to ask you because we want more people to hear the show. In addition to that, if you could rate and review us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen, we would greatly appreciate it. See you next week. Bye.